Wednesday lecture series celebrating Groton's 300th anniversary. We present to you Carol Kimball, noted author, columnist, Groton historian, and friend of the library. Today she will speak about Groton's sea captains.
I am going to speak tonight about Groton sea captains, and there were hundreds of them, literally, and they came from every part of the town. Some of them went to sea because they had a hard life farming, and they wanted to get away from it. Some went to sea because they lived right on the shore of the rivers, and it seemed a logical thing to do, and it promised a very exciting life. Some of them went because it was in their family. I'm going to talk about John O. Spicer, whose father was also a sea captain. And then we have in Mystic the example of the Gates family, where there were 4 brothers who were all sea captains. Captain Gurdon, the oldest, trained the others, Captain Isaac, Captain George Washington, and Captain Charles, and they all commanded beautiful vessels, most of them Mystic built, and went to many ports in the world. I have chosen captains from all different parts of the town. I'm going to talk about 5 of them. And they had adventures in all the places from the Arctic to Egypt to South America, the Pacific, the Antarctic Ocean. We have the example of Captain Rattler Morgan from the Groton Bank, who made a name for himself whaling in the Desolation Island down in Antarctica, and later made a fortune as the first captain to go to Alaska after it became part of the United States. So he pretty much covered the world. In fact, the world was the oyster for these Mystic and Groton captains. And the interesting thing is, they have left us tangible things to remember them by, every one of them that I will talk about. Now, I wasn't clever enough to get together a set of slides, but I do have some pictures which I will pass around from time to time. Not a lot, but something that might make it easier for you to visualize these men that we are going to talk about tonight. And the first one I'm going to discuss is Captain Silas Beebe. And he gave his name to Beebe Cove and also to Bpawn, which is part of the town's green space, a very important part. He's the only one of the men I'm going to talk about tonight that was not born in Groton. He was born in Waterford in 1781, but he remedied that by coming over to Groton as soon as he was able as a young man. He came in 1805. He was able to be master of his own sloop, the Nancy, and he married and made a success the good old-fashioned way by marrying the sister of a Mystic captain. He married Hannah Raspin, the sister of Elisha Raspin, Captain Elisha Raspin. That's the family for whom Raspin Place is named. In 1808, Silas Beebe was prosperous enough to buy land at the foot of Devil's Foot Hill. That's the hill which slopes down on Route 1 going toward Noang. And he built a fine house on the cove. That house still stands, probably with additions, sold recently for $1 million+. And he used to keep his sloop there in Beebe Cove. And this would have been before the railroad bridge was built, so he could easily get out to sea or come up the river to Mystic. And during the Great Gale of 1815, which was really a hurricane, but they weren't calling it that in those days, the sloop Ranger washed up the river and landed somewhere near the Mystic Arts Center. Captain Beebe was engaged in coastal trading to about 1830. He went to New Orleans and many other ports, and among other things, he went to the Cape Verde Islands. And when he was at the Cape Verde Islands, he found a likely young man whose name was Manuel Sebastian. And he brought Manuel Sebastian back to Mystic. And you may know that Manuel eventually married Tamar Buchel, who was the ward of the Pequots, And there are many Sebastians in our area today who are members of Mashantucket and some of the other tribes around here. When he grew too old to command his own vessel, Silas Beebe became a whaling partner with Jedediah Randall, and they had 6 whaling vessels that went out from Mystic: the Aeronaut, the Bingham, the Blackstone, the Globe, Tampico, and the Uxor. And he lived in his home on the Cove, and the pond, which is now part of Groton open space, was used for ice, to provide ice for his home, and also later for no-ank sloops. Now, as far as I know, there's no picture of Silas Beebe, but I'm going to pass around some pictures, and this one is taken by Julia Beebe Coates, who is one of his descendants. And it shows Beebe Cove looking north with the original trolley bridge, which is now part of Route 1. I don't know whether there's still a bridge under it or whether it's been filled in. And on the right, you can see the ice house. Now, I'll give this to Sarah, and she can pass it around. And later, we'll give them to Sean because he needs them for his work. Silas Beebe was a member of the Union Baptist Church, and they sorrowfully reported his death at the age of 82 in 1863, and he is buried in Lower Mystic Cemetery with his 3 wives. Not only Hannah, but when Hannah passed to her reward, he married Nancy Breed, and after her death married Prudence Morgan. Bpawn Woods was acquired by the town in 1958. It's a total of 95 acres. It was acquired in 3 separate tracts. And we have the pond and the cove to remember him. And also, a collection of his whaling artifacts was presented to the Stonington Historical Society in 1919 by Julia Beebe Coates, the same woman who took the photograph. She was a noted photographer in the area. And included in that is the log of the whaler Blackstone, which I saw recently at the Lighthouse Museum. So we do have tangible memories of him. The next person I'm going to talk about is Captain Nathan Gallup Fish. He was born in Mystic in the farmhouse that still stands at the corner of High Street and Sandy Hollow Road. That was open on our last house tour last summer. Maybe some of you visited that. He was the son of Deacon Fish of the Union Baptist Church and Bridget Gallup, which explains why he's Nathan Gallup Fish. And he was born in 1804. And his brother Alden married Sally Beebe, related somehow. They were all related in Mystic and Groton. And Alden was the great-grandfather of Hope Luba, who lives in that house now, lives in the Fish homestead. And I will show you a picture of Captain Nathan Gallup Fish. He went to sea when we went very well. He was very successful. At the age of 25, he was captain of the brig Tampico. And this brig went to South America with a large cargo, and it included bottles of special wine that was sent to Simon Bolivar, the great liberator in South America. And he happened to be a friend of Silas E. Burroughs, who was born in Old Mystic and was a world traveler and knew all the important people there were to know. Nathan Fish was the captain of many vessels in the coastal trade, including the brig Emmeline to Apalachicola, and also the schooner Creole to New Orleans. And when he retired from the sea, he established a general store down sort of in back of where the Emporium is now, the NG Fish Company, and it was also a ship chandlery. They would outfit vessels for the sea. And in 1853, in partnership with the shipbuilder Maxim and Benjamin Hoxie, He established the Maxim Fish Company, shipbuilding, a shipyard down at West Mystic where the Yacht Center is now. And he was a very public figure. Carl Cutler once told me that it was no wonder that Groton and Noank and Mystic were prosperous maritime villages, because there were so many sea captains who lived there, and they were very civic-minded. And captains had to be in charge of their vessel. They had to be resourceful. They were the sole authority when they were miles from any shore or any help of any kind in the days before there were wireless or any method of communication. And they were very self-reliant and important and independent men. Captain Nathan Fish went to the legislature for 6 terms. He was Groton Judge of Probate in 1854. And that same year, he was the first president of the Groton Savings Bank, which we now know as Chelsea Groton. So you see, he still is having an influence. And furthermore, when he was in the legislature, he was on the committee that was deciding where the railroad tracks would go when they were laid in 1858 or before 1858. The train started then. And it was he who decided that the tracks would come right through the village of Mystic. The original plan had been to put them to the south, but he felt that Mystic should be on the map, and that's why we have the railroad station and the tracks and so forth where they are today, because he was on that committee. Nathan Gallup Fitch built a fine home at the corner of West Mystic Avenue and Route 1. That house is for sale today, I think, for $900,000. You have to admit these captains knew their real estate, and they picked out fine property in their time, which has certainly appreciated through the years. Due to a friendship that he made while he was serving in the legislature, he had become acquainted with C.S. Bushnell. And Bushnell, during the Civil War, was involved in the movement to introduce ironclads in the Navy. And because he knew N.G. Fish, and he knew he had a shipyard, that Maxim Fish shipyard got the contract to build the ironclad Galena, which was one of the first ironclads in our Navy. And this was a very innovative type of construction. Mystic and Groton and Noank had built strictly wooden vessels. And most of the people felt that if you covered a vessel with iron, it would surely sink. But fortunately, it floated. It might not have been too successful, but it was certainly a pioneer effort, and Captain Nathan Fish was at the head of doing this. Maxim and Fish built many other vessels, beautiful wooden clippers, and one of them was the B.F. Hoxie, which was launched in 1854, a very beautiful and sleek clipper vessel. And Nathan Gallup Fish was part owner of this vessel. Unfortunately, during the Civil War, the B.F. Hoxie was captured and burned by the Confederate raid of Florida in 1862. And the Hoxie carried a large cargo, a very valuable cargo, and the cargo was not insured because the Yankees always kept their fingers crossed and they didn't like to pay the insurance fee. So it was uninsured, and this cargo of silver bars was lost, and it was owned by British investors. And because of this great loss, Captain Fish lost all of his property trying to recompense the owners for the loss. Eventually, there were Alabama claims, and some of the money was paid back, but that came after his death. He died in August 1870 at the age of 65, and the Mystic Press reported the flag on the Liberty Bowl was at half-mast at the death of one of our most esteemed citizens and businessmen. His estate was sadly sold at auction in May 1871, including a number of vessels in which he held shares and his beautiful house and so forth. Later that was reclaimed by a member of the family, or at least his son-in-law. Excuse me. The next captain we're going to talk about tonight is Captain Henry E. Davis. And he was born near Old Mystic, September 20th, 1826. But at an early age, he moved to Noank, and I think Noank generally claims him as their own. His home stands on Pearl Street, sort of opposite the Universal Store. It's a beautiful gingerbready house. Captain Davis apparently was a sea captain, although he forsook the sea for a different kind of a career. He worked on Noank fishing vessels, and he must have become master of one because people were not called captain in those days unless they had earned the title and really been in command of a vessel. But after he worked on the Noank fishing vessel, he went to the Palma shipyard in Noank and learned to build wooden vessels. And then, after he learned the carpenter's trade, he forsook that to build houses. And one of his masterpieces was the Deacon Palma house. If you're going down to Abbott's, it's the large house just before you get there. It's been known, I think, as the haunted house. He also, in 1869, built the second Noank light on Morgan Point. That still stands, but it's been very much added to. But he was definitely a builder. But the height of his career came in 1879 when he was chosen to bring the Obelisk Cleopatras Needle to New York. And I'll pass around a picture of Cleopatras Needle, which Captain, it was an obelisk and had really nothing to do with Cleopatra. It was just given that by some advertising agent that wanted to attract attention. And actually, Cleopatra's Needle dated back to 1500 BC when it was built in Egypt and by one of the pharaohs. And then it had later been moved to Alexandria. That and a twin, there were two of them. And it was a huge thing, built of rose red granite, and it was 69 feet, 6 inches long, and weighed 224 tons. Well, the Khedive of Egypt was anxious to establish commercial relationships with England and the United States, and so to work up a list and things Egyptian, he presented these obelisks, one to England, and it had been moved there, where it stood in London in 1878. And then he offered one to the United States. And the United States appointed Lieutenant Gorringe of the United States Navy to head an expedition to bring this huge thing across the ocean and set it up in New York. And Davis left Noank on the 25th of August in 1879, and he was in charge of excavating and bringing building the launching ways, arranging the derricks, the piers. He had to buy a steamer. He bought the steamer de Souk from the Egyptian government and had to equip it so that it would hold this obelisk to bring it across the ocean. He managed to do it by changing the stepping of one of the masts and making a special opening for it. And they managed to get it in, and they came across the ocean in this ship and arrived in New York City in July 20th, 1880. But then they had to get it from the shore, New York, to Central Park, which was quite a long journey. And so they started working on it in July, and it actually took them 112 days to carry that obelisk through the streets of New York to Central Park, and it was a distance of 2 1/10 miles. They used 32 horses arranged in 16 pairs, and they managed to make the average of 99 feet a day. They had to build a special bridge over one of the rivers, and but they did manage in triumph to get it there and erect it, and it's there today. It's rather badly eroded by the wind and the pollution, but it does stand directly in back of the Metropolitan Museum in Central Park. And it's a very rare object because there are actually only 30 obelisks left in the world, and this is one of them. If you click on Cleopatras Needle, if you search on Cleopatras Needle in the internet, you will find the story of it, and unfortunately you will not find a mention of Captain Henry Davis of Noank, who did all the work. It refers to Lieutenant Gorringe, and it will tell you the story, though, of how it was moved. When Captain Davis got back to Noank, he entered government service in 1885. He became the assistant superintendent of lighthouse construction, of life-saving station construction, rather, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And when this man was 78 years old, he supervised the life-saving site on Fish's Island. And he also built at the Palma shipyard a floating life-saving station, which was used in the Boston area in 1896. And he died in 1909, and he certainly has left us a memento in Cleopatra's Needle, which is still standing in New York. The next gentleman I'm going to discuss is Captain John Orrin Spicer, who was born in Easton Point in 1835. He is the latest of all of the captains I'm talking about today. And as I said before, his father commanded coastal vessels, although he retired from the sea in 1833 and went to farming 2 years before John Orrin Spicer was born. But still, John Orrin went to sea when he was 16, and he shipped on a whaler and spent 3 years in the North Pacific. During the Civil War, he commanded supply vessels in South Carolina in 1862. And that was the year that he married Nancy Avery. And here is a picture of him as a young man. Thank you, Sally. In 1863, he began a career of whaling in the North, in the Arctic Ocean. Now, whaling during the 1850s had been pursued with such vigor that the whales were becoming very scarce, and it was very difficult to find them. And another thing that had entered the picture was the fact that petroleum had been discovered, and whale oil was no longer so much in demand for lighting because kerosene was going to take its place. However, there was still a market for whale oil and also for whale bone, which was necessary for women's corsets. Very necessary if you were going to be in style in those days. So they began to look for other whaling fields since the whales had left most of the usual places, and they found them up north in the Arctic around Davis Strait. And John Orrin Spicer developed a new method of whaling. Usually, the vessels went pursuing the whales actively across the ocean. But this was very difficult in the Arctic. There was a very short season because the ice would come in and made it very difficult for this type of whaling. So that John Orrin Spicer decided that he would set up a whaling station up in the Arctic, and he would winter over and send people out to procure the whale oil and the whale bones. And then he would have vessels going back and forth from the Arctic to New London, taking the oil and the bone. And so he built a little building there, which he calls always Spicer's Farm. But he learned to respect and live like the Eskimos, and he dressed like them. He lived off the land. And this was in marked contrast to many explorers who had gone to the Arctic. The next gentleman I'll talk about. When the British went to explore the Arctic, they expected to live exactly the way they did in England. They packed everything. They packed cut glass, glasses for wine. They packed silver tea services. They took all their food. John Orrin Spicer believed that he should learn to live the way the Eskimos lived, and he did. He was very popular with the Eskimos and very famous because he would treat them medically for any sicknesses or injuries that they had. And he was very popular and respected. And he was particularly friendly with one Eskimo whose name I think was Chimawako, and very difficult to pronounce, as you can see. And the Yankee whalemen had a way of giving nicknames to these Eskimos. And so this Eskimo that he liked was called John Bull. There were many various nicknames that they were given that were easier to pronounce. It was kind of disrespectful for the Eskimos, but that's how it was in those days. He hired John Bull to look over the whaling station that he had established there, and he left him and told him that he would be back the following spring to pick up the bone and the oil that John Bull had accumulated. And he was caught in the ice. Captain Spicer was caught in the ice, and he was later getting back to John Bull than he had hoped. Before he got back, some New Bedford whalers came, and they said to John Bull that they would like to buy the oil and bone. John Bull said they belonged to Captain Spicer. He said, "Oh, didn't we tell you? Captain Spicer is dead." John Bull wouldn't believe them, but the New Bedford whalers stole the bone and the oil, and they went away with it. And a little bit later, Captain Spicer arrived on the scene, and John Bull told him the story. Captain Spicer was very angry over this, and so when he got back to New London, he and the owner of his whaling vessel decided that they would sue the New Bedford firm who had stolen the supplies from him. And so Spicer sent to the north and had John Bull come to Groton so that he could testify. And John Bull did come to Groton and brought along with him his wife, whom they called Annie. I'm not sure what her Eskimo name was, and their daughter. I'm not even going to try to pronounce her name, but here's a picture of them taken in New London after they arrived in full Eskimo glory. And John Bull arrived on one of the whaling vessels of the firm, and Captain Spicer loaded him on a train. He had never ridden on a train. And they took themselves to Massachusetts, and John Bull testified against the New Bedford whalemen who had stolen the supplies, and Captain Spicer won the suit. $6,712, which in terms of the 1870s would be a great deal more now. And when John Bull got back to Groton, Captain Spicer built a house for him over in the Eastern Point area. He gave him a gun, he got him a dog, he got him a boat, and he wanted him to stay. And the Eskimos made many appearances around town in their dress, and they were very, very popular. But John Bull would not stay in Groton. He hated the climate. He begged to go back to the Arctic. So eventually, they allowed him to go. He went back on one of the vessels which were going back and forth in a sort of a relay. And there was a big surprise because the day before he was about to sail, Annie, his wife, presented him with a new baby daughter, whom naturally they named American Girl. Captain Spicer presented a lot of material to the Smithsonian, and one of the whale skeletons, which he had brought back to Groton, it said that he may have intended to give that to the Smithsonian too, but it eventually ended up in Charles Q. Eldridge's museum on the River Road, where Charles Q. billed it as the largest whale ever caught in the world. John Orrin Spicer had sailed to Hudson Bay longer than any other captain, and he once stayed there for 42 months on a stretch. That's almost 4 years, living in Spicer's farm there. He finally retired to the farm in 1892, and he was very well known in Groton because he always wore a sombrero, which he had acquired on a trip to the west, and Eskimo boots, which were made of sealskin. So he was a very colorful character. Now it's interesting, he and his wife never had any children, but they were related by marriage to the Williams family that lived on Quackataw Hill, the big old white house that we always called the Prentice Williams house. It used to be where Biddle Morris lived, but he has since moved from there. And they were related somehow by marriage, and one of the sons of the Williams family was named John Orrin Spicer Williams. He was born in 1896. And many of Captain Spicer's artifacts went to that house. I think after his death, his wife went to live with that family for a while. And they had portraits and various paintings of vessels and that sort of thing, and even Captain Spicer's sea chest, which now is in the possession of my friend Rudy Favretti, because he was very close to that family. You may have read that book that he wrote about Once Upon Quackataw. And the final gentleman I'm going to discuss tonight is James Monroe Buddington. And he was born in Center Groton in 1817. And he hated farming. So when he was 17, he ran away to sea. And he was very successful. At the age of 24, he was commanding his own whale ship in the Pacific. But then for some reason, he left the sea and tried his hand at farming again. He may have had a bad time in his life because at this period he got divorced from his first wife, which is very unusual in those days, and eventually married his cousin, Julia Woodward, who was somewhat younger than he. I will pass this around too if you will help me, Sally. Thank you. Now, whaling, as I had told you before, had changed, and that the people in New London were looking to the Arctic for whaling rather than traveling to the South Pacific, and as they had in other years. And so Captain James Monroe Buddington was commanding the bark George Henry, and it had a crew of 25 and included with the captain's own son, James Waterman Buddington. And they left New London the 20th of May in 1855. Captain Buddington was 38 at the time. And they were looking for whales in the Arctic. And unfortunately, there was a dearth of whales, very poor pickings. The Arctic, at this time in the 19th century, was sort of like the space frontier of today. Everybody was going to explore in the Arctic, and they were looking for this mythical Northwest Passage, a remarkable passage which was supposed to go from somewhere near Greenland across the top of the world and come out near Alaska. And in this way, they would have a quick way to get to the Orient, and which would avoid that long, tiresome journey around South America and Cape Horn, which was the only way to get to the Orient until the days of the Panama Canal, which were far in the future. And so many expeditions were fitted out to look for this mythical Northwest Passage, which of course did not exist. One special expedition from England was led by Sir John Franklin, and it was a large expedition of 100 men, and in 1845 they had disappeared in the Arctic, complete with their silver tea services and all the other stuff they had brought along, because they did not realize that in order to live in the Arctic, you had to live the way the natives had discovered would work there and would keep you alive. Well, Sir John Franklin was lost in the Arctic, and everyone in the world went to find him. And the British government fitted out an expedition in 1852 under Sir Edward Belcher. And they had the finest vessels. Now, in 1852 is before the age of steam, so these were sail vessels. And they were also wooden vessels, because we had not yet gone into what they like to call iron vessels, and as we know them today as steel. There was one vessel in Sir Edward Belcher's group, which was Her Majesty's Resolute, and it was the state of the art in those days. Her timbers were made of teak in order to breast the pack ice and so forth, and she even had an iron prow. Well, Sir Edward Belcher's expedition stayed there for 2 years, and mostly frozen in the ice for most of the time. And they finally threw in the towel and decided to leave their vessels, and they trekked over the ice to open water. And the crew of the Resolute left the vessel, taking only their navigational instruments and some of the sails, and made for open water so that they could get back to England. So the Resolute was left in the ice and drifted from Melville Sound, where they deserted her, to Davis Strait in about 2 years, a distance of 1,100 miles. And then along comes James Monroe Buddington. He was looking for whales in this area, and he was up on the lookout, and he didn't see any whales, but he did see a stranded vessel in the distance. So he investigated, and it proved to be HMS Resolute, which was frozen in the ice. And since whales were so scarce, he thought it would probably be more profitable to salvage the vessel and bring it back to New London than to look further for whales. So he got some of his crew over there, and they were able to pump out the vessel. There was 7 feet of water in the hold. They had to chop the ice off because she was listing badly, but they managed to get her afloat. And although the pack ice was closing in early that year, they finally managed to get her free. It was September 10th, 1855, when he first discovered the vessel. And when he had salvaged it, he managed to jury-rig the lower mast. He divided the crew and to sail the vessel back to New London. He took 10 seamen from the George Henry and left the rest on the original vessel. And they left the Arctic October 21st, 1855. And because there were no navigational instruments aboard the Resolute, it was very hard for James Monroe Buddington. He had only a watch, a quadrant, and what he called a miserable compass. But he was a good seaman, and he got the vessel back to New London after a stormy 4-day passage. He arrived in New London just before Christmas, December 23rd, 1855. It was one of the coldest winters on record, and the Thames was almost completely frozen over. And he docked the vessel at Fort Trumbull, and thousands came to visit it. They could walk over the ice, and it was just the talk of the town, and it made all the headlines in the national newspapers. Now, at this time, the relationship with Great Britain was not at a very warm level. There had been some indifference in negotiations or some sort. So somebody thought it would be a wonderful idea and a beautiful gesture for the United States government to purchase the Resolute from the George Henry owners who had salvaged her. And this they did for $40,000. And then the government had the Resolute completely refitted. And she was as good as new when they sailed her back to England as a gift for Queen Victoria. And they arrived in December 1856. It took them about a year to get all this done. And Queen Victoria herself came down to the dock and went aboard the Resolute on December 12th. And it was a very nice case of international friendship. But now this vessel, the Resolute, was in the British Navy for a while, but her days were numbered because she was badly out of date. The Navy was changing from wooden vessels to the so-called iron vessels, and from sail to steam. So that after 20 years, the Resolute was scrapped, and that was in 1879. And when the vessel was scrapped, Queen Victoria gave orders that 3 desks be made from her teak timber, elaborately carved desks. One of these desks was given to the wife of Henry Grinnell. He was an American philanthropist who had financed a lot of expedition to look for Sir John Franklin. The second desk was given to James Monroe Buddington, although whatever happened to this desk, we don't know. It somehow got lost, and no one in James Buddington's family knows what happened to that desk. It seems strange that such a desk could be lost, but it was. And the third one was given to President Rutherford B. Hayes. I stand corrected. In 1880, and it was put in the White House. And I have not a very good picture of the desk, unfortunately, but enough so that you can see there is elaborate carving. And this desk was resurrected by Jacqueline Kennedy and placed in John Kennedy's Oval Office, where it has been ever since. And you many times see pictures of the Oval Office, and that desk came into being because of our famous Groton captain. In fact, last September, there was a picture in Time magazine of the desk, and George W. Bush had his feet up on it. Which really upset me. I thought Barbara had brought him up better than that. However, I guess the desk, being of teak, could stand a little mistreatment. So James Monroe Buddington retired finally to a farm in Pequannock. He lived pretty well all over our town of Groton, so he's a good captain to close with. Born in Center Groton, he lived at Groton Bank at the time that he rescued the Resolute, and eventually moved to Pequannock Bridge with his second wife. He died in Sailor's Snug Harbor on Long Island on the 23rd of December, 1908. And oddly enough, that was the 53rd anniversary of the day that the Resolute was brought into New London. Captain Buddington was buried from the Pequannock Bridge Baptist Church. It was the largest funeral they had ever had there, and presiding over it was the Reverend Osmer Buddington, who was one of his nephews. The Buddingtons were a very large and plentiful family, and a good many of them were famous sea captains, including James Monroe's son, James Waterman, who captained or commanded the last whaling trip out of New London, I think about 1909. I'm a little hazy about that date. So that the few sea captains that I've discussed tonight are representative of the many from our town of Groton who went to sea and had amazing adventures and have left us many mementos, ranging from the desk in the Oval Room in the White House to Beebe's Pond and Cove, beautiful houses which stand around our town that belong to them, exhibits in the Smithsonian and the Stonington Historical Society, all of the memories of men of Groton who went to sea. Thank you very much for your attention.